Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, colleagues. So whoever in whatever time zone. So I would like to welcome you, dear participants, to our SBSTTA webinar session. And I would like to invite SBSTA Chair, Ezequiel Benitez, who will chair all our SBSTA information webinars this week and next week. Ezequiel, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sasha. Dear colleagues, good morning in Asia Pacific region, good evening in Mexico and the Americas. I hope all of you are fine and healthy in this new year that I hope will be much better than 2020. Many of you attend the previous webinars in preparation for SBSTTA, including on agenda item 3 held in last June, the special virtual sessions for SBSTTA and SBI held in September, and the special virtual session for SBSTTA and SBI 3 on biodiversity, one held and COVID-19 last December. Today, we open the SBSTA information briefings to continue this process to provide you with more information on pre-session documents for the meeting. As the outset, I would like to invite the Deputy Executive Secretary of the Convention of Biological Diversity, David Cooper, to provide us with a few remarks. David, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Ezequiel. And dear colleagues, I'd like to welcome you all to this webinar today on the documents for agenda item 3 on at SBSTA, and particularly the monitoring framework for the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Despite the challenging times that we're all living through, I hope you're all doing well, and I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to participate in this webinar. I'd like to express my appreciation on behalf of Elizabeth Marema, the Executive Secretary, to our SBSTA Chair for all his great work and leadership in preparing for the upcoming meeting of SBSTA, the 24th meeting of the subsidiary body on scientific, technical and technological advice. We know that SBSTA 24 will have a lot on its plate. It's COP14 asked SBSTA to advise on the development of the Post-2020 framework. We have then mandates coming from the first and the second meetings of the working group on the Post-2020 framework, as well as from SBSTA 23. And SBSTA is really a big opportunity to ensure that the Post-2020 framework benefits from the best scientific and technical advice that this body can bring forward. I'm sure that with Ezequiel's leadership, we will arrive at a good set of recommendations that will help to carry forward the work advising the working group on the Post-2020 framework. I'd also like to thank our partners and colleagues from UNEP WCMC and members of the Biodiversity Indicators Partnership for their continuous support and contributions to this work. The draft monitoring framework and the other recommendations developed under agenda item 3 will be particularly important to the future work supporting implementation and review of the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which in turn, of course, will promote the objectives of the convention and of the protocols, the Cartagena Protocol and the Nagoya Protocol. Last week at the webinar, the SBI webinar on SBI Agenda 3, which is devoted to monitoring and review mechanisms, we discussed the important linkages between the work on indicators and the development of strong planning, monitoring, reporting and review mechanisms. So recommendations developed at SBSTTA will also contribute to the work of SBI at its third meeting later this year. The webinar today, as well as those being convened earlier and in the coming days, will help us to make the most of the opportunity that SBSTTA provides and the informal session of SBSTA that will take place in February provides. So colleagues, 2021 is shaping up, I think, to be an exciting, certainly a very, very busy year. While the ongoing pandemic continues to create a lot of uncertainty, I'm sure that with all your cooperation, we'll be able to navigate the difficult times ahead. As always, my colleagues at the Secretariat will do the utmost to support you, to support the parties, to support the chair in this last few months before we go to Kunming in China. So again, welcome. Thank you for taking the time to participate in this webinar today. I'll hand back to our chair, Ezekiel. Thank you.
Thank you, David, Deputy Executive Secretary, for your warm welcome remarks and for being here with us today. I trust that this series of webinars and this first one on agenda item 3 will put us in a better position to have a fruitful meeting in SBSTA 24. I would like to thank you for your support in facilitating these webinars and preparing SBSTA meeting. Dear participants, welcome to the first of 3 briefing webinars on SBSTA 24 documents. I would like to thank you for joining us today, as during the last week on SBI documents with my colleague Charlotta Sorkis, the chair of SBI. I trust that this series of webinars will put us in a better position to have a fruitful meeting in SBSTA. Agenda item 3 is particularly important for moving forward towards strengthening the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and implementation period. Without effective monitoring on the progress, we will not be able to achieve goals and targets of the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. It is important that we get this item right and are able to provide a strong contribution to the open-ended working group at this third meeting in COP15. The development of a strong monitoring framework and a good set of indicators is directly linked to the review and reporting mechanisms as it was presented during the webinar of SBI 3 agenda item 9 last week on January 21st. During the session today, we will receive an overview of the proposal contained in SBSTA documents under this agenda item. This includes the main elements of the proposal, which are included in SBSTA/24/3 and its addenda, as well as the key information document 16 on indicators. First, we will hear from CBD Secretariat on the entire documents package for item 3 and linkages among key documents. The second presentation is on principles for the logic for development of the monitoring framework, groups of indicators, and criteria for choosing indicators. The third presentation will help to understand how the information document was developed and what kind of specific information about indicators suggests for the monitoring framework can be used by parties during SBSTA sessions to discuss indicators. Documents 3, its addendum 1, and information document 16 for this agenda item are available online on the SBSTA 24 main page. The addendum 2 to document 3 is at final stage of preparation and will be posted soon and before the informal meeting. Before we begin, I would like to remind everyone that this webinar is intended to assist parties and observers in becoming familiar with the documentation for SBSTTA 24, its structure and key elements of content, and to respond to questions from participants on those topics. It is not negotiation sessions, and the statements and views expressed during the webinars will not be considered part of the official work of SBSTTA. After each presentation, we will have dedicated time for you to ask questions. You can ask questions at any time during today's session. To do it, please use the question window located at the right of your screen. When asking a question, please include your name and party or organization affiliation in order to help us to better manage the questions. Lastly, I would like to inform you that today's session is being recorded and that it will be available on the convention website later in the week, along with the presentations that have been made. With those remarks, I would like to hand over to the Secretariat for the first presentation. Sasha, you have the floor.
Thank you, Sekio. And just checking if you can see my screen.
Not yet, we can see you.
Okay. Now, good. Thank you. So, colleagues, again, a good time of the day to all of you. So we like to start this webinar with just providing to you an overview of the package of documents prepared or in preparation for this agenda item. So I will cover in general the key documents and linkages among them and also how we develop them. But later on, my colleagues from the Secretariat and also our partner from WCMC will provide additional information on specific documents. So first of all, just to remind that the mandate for us to work on this agenda item came from COP decisions from the last COP, COP 14, but also recommendations of SBSTTA as well as recommendations of the open-ended working group on Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And open-ended working group provides for those recommendations both at its first meeting and in particular at the second meeting, where actually the group invited SBSTTA to provide an advice for the third meeting of the open-ended working group on scientific and technical analysis of goals and targets, but also related indicators for the monitoring of progress and baselines. And that's what we were working on in preparing documents. So what official documents you have in front of you for discussion at SBSTTA? So first of all, it's document CBD SBSTTA 24/2. This document is on the 5th edition of the Global Biodiversity Outlook. I hope that many of you were able to attend in September the launch of GBO5 and also had an opportunity to go through this important assessment, which provides us a lot of information for moving forward towards Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, learning from experience of implementation during the last 10 years of the strategic plan. The second document, SBSTTA 24/3, that's a pretty short document and the main document on this agenda item. And I will say a few more words about this document in particular at the later slides. 24/3 has two addenda. So addendum 1, that's actually the document which introduces the draft monitoring framework. So it provides for a description of the logic behind different groups of indicators, explaining the criteria to select indicators. And my colleague will present lots of details about this document and the monitoring framework itself later today. And the second is the addendum 2. It is not online yet. It's in the process to be finalized. And as our chair mentioned already, it will be published before the informal meeting. This addendum 2 is providing for an overview for each goal and target on a number of specific scientific and technical aspects. And again, later in my presentation, I will touch upon this document. We also have information documents. I would like specifically to highlight two of them. The information document 16, which provides for indicators for Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And this document was prepared in close collaboration with our partners and UNEP, WCMC, and also Biodiversity Indicators Partnership and members of these partnerships. They've been very instrumental for having this document prepared. And again, later today, we will hear from our colleagues from WCMC details about this document. The second important information document, which initially was out for peer review in summer, that is the linkages between suggested goals and targets and SDGs. This document is at the final stage of update after comments and will be also published online before informal meeting. But I also like to draw your attention to a number of other information documents prepared and submitted by our partners, including, for example, one based on outcomes of dialogue organized by indigenous peoples and local communities. And those information documents also will be very interesting for you to go through to get more information and to get more context for the upcoming discussions at SBSTTA. You see, we have a number of different documents. So I will try to explain maybe a little bit better how they relate to each other. So we definitely have a global biodiversity framework, and in a way, it's a key document which need to be supported by deliberations at SBSTTA, and all our documents for this agenda item 3 are actually in support of open-ended working group and also later COP to complete discussion, negotiation, and adoption of global biodiversity framework. But this agenda item, the key document, as I mentioned, is document 3, which introduces in a short way the scope, the concept. It actually proposes headline indicators and definitely includes a number of recommendations. This document was very much informed by outcomes and findings from the 5th edition of GBO, but also the addendum 2 with scientific guidance on goals and targets. Addendum 1 is also definitely clearly related to document 3 because addendum 1 provides the whole monitoring framework, including headline indicators referred to and introduced by document 3. And in its turn, addendum 1 was very much informed and linked to the information document 16, where all indicators included in the monitoring framework. In information document 16, you may find a lot of different scientific and technical, very relevant information to describe those indicators and understand better why those indicators were chosen. And again, as I mentioned, the information document 12 on linkages to SDGs together with monitoring framework together with GBO and Addendum 2 directly contribute to the third meeting of the Open-Ended Working Group and Global Biodiversity Framework. In addition, we have two other aspects already mentioned by Ezekiel and David, referring to SBI 3. We have a global analytical review and national reporting to be discussed within agenda of SBI 3, and documents, especially monitoring framework, has a direct relation to both of them. So they also need to be seen in connection to each other. I would not say too much about Global Biodiversity Outlook, as again, you had an opportunity to be part of the launch, but also familiarize yourself with the document itself. Just like to reiterate that Section 2 and also in particular Section 3 of the GBO5 are extremely important for further discussions on post-2020, informing the development of biodiversity framework, but also very relevant for the development of indicators as well as the components and future discussion on components of different targets, but also providing the rational and scientific and technical background for goals and targets. So document 3, as I mentioned, in a very short form, introduces two addendums, the one with monitoring framework and one with the underlying scientific basis. It also introduces the headline indicators. You can find them in Annex 1 of this document, and recommendations in the last section of the document. Recommendation, among others, one of them is to propose to Conference of the Parties to establish technical expert group on indicators. So Annex 2 of this document includes the draft terms of reference for this technical expert group. And in second presentation today, you will hear a little bit more about the tasks and mandate for this group. There are many different documents, processes behind the development of draft monitoring framework. That's definitely existing as CBD indicators. You may recall previous decisions of 1328, but also 10.3. That's also existing reporting processes within the convention and protocols. We definitely pay attention and explore in details the SDG indicators. That's information coming both from Global Biodiversity Outlook, but also a Local Biodiversity Outlook, which also was launched at the end of last year. Indicators developed by Biodiversity Indicators Partnership, and information and discussions provided by the Open-Ended Working Group, especially at the second meeting. And of course, I think you may recall that since the end of 2019, we issued two notifications, invited parties and observers to provide your views and your comments and ideas for targets, but also indicators and baseline. Both of them were used very much for developing this draft. The last peer review happened from June to August last year, considered three documents: the draft monitoring framework developed after the second meeting of the Open-Ended Working Group, the linkages to SDGs, and the information document on indicators. I would like to thank everyone who actively participated in this peer review process. We received a tremendous amount of comments. You can see that over 60 parties, almost 190 observers. We received actually almost 10,000 specific comments. What was also important for us that this time we were able to engage 12 national statistical offices in providing their comments. Now a few words about Addendum 2 before you see it online. So this document summarizes in a relatively short form the key pieces of information for each goal and target related to relevance of issues addressed by those goals and targets, the current status of the issue, what is also definitely very interesting for many and important for the framework, the possible quantitative values for those targets and goals where it's relevant to actually keep them smart to the extent possible. And also what is really important is a connection between particular goals and targets to other goals and targets. Though this document is relatively short, you also will be able to see at a later stage the synthetic summaries for each goal and target presented in a more, say, bulky way through the number of associated information documents. So I would like to stop here, Ezekiel. So, and as we have a round of questions, we'll be happy to respond together with Ezekiel and colleagues to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sasha, for that informative presentation. I hope was clear enough to see how the different documents fit together to prepare the monitoring framework, which is one of the main tasks that the second meeting of the open-ended working group asked SBSTTA 24 to do. Now we will take a bit time to respond to any questions you may have. In order to ask a question, please use the question window located at the right of your screen. When asking a question, please remember to include your name and party or organization or affiliation. I see there is a couple of questions. So, Secretary, can we have the questions, please?
Certainly. So the first question is noting the close linkages between the goals and targets as well as the indicators, but also noting that work on the goals and targets is ongoing and they're not fully developed yet. How do you, or how does the SBSTTA chair and the secretariat plan on dealing with this issue? This sort of the fact that we're discussing indicators before the goals and targets have been agreed, and will there be an opportunity to further adjust the indicators once the goals and targets are revised? And if so, when would that occur? So a big sort of open-ended question, I guess, on the relationship between the goals and targets and the indicators. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, as you can see, we're working in parallel with the work of the open-ended working group. Of course, for the third meeting, they are expecting to have feedback from SBSTTA and SBI to put all pieces together. Since SBSTTA do not have the mandate to negotiate the goals and targets, we've been asked to work on the indicators on the basis of the zero draft and comments present during the second meeting in Rome. And so we will try to do our best we will see in for the presentations the 3 levels of indicators, and maybe to have some discussions around the linkages between the goals and targets and to provide some advice to the co-chairs of the open-ended working group. So we will propose at the end of SBSTTA as much as possible an architecture with some indicators, some headline indicators, also to identify some gaps on elements that has to be developed. That is why when Sasha mentioned the content of document 3, one of the sections is the terms of reference for a group of experts on indicators that will, after COP, continue the work to fill the gaps and to improving the framework on this matter. So we are working in parallel in this sense, since goals and targets are not approved yet by the Conference of the Parties. I don't know if Sasha would like to add something.
Yeah, maybe just a few words that, of course, the fact that we are doing this work in parallel and adjusting both the indicators, but also language of goals and targets and components was also very much dictated by the position of many parties that we need to have the monitoring framework being ready at the early stages rather than spending a lot of time after adoption of the framework to bring it in. The positive side also is that developing indicators, working on them, linking them to different components of goals and targets, that's actually helping to get a better understanding of suggested goals and targets, including in terms of making them smart, but also making them measurable. Whether we know that we have indicators in place to measure progress or not, or maybe we have some gaps, and the early knowledge of that may help us to adjust in future. Although the intention is that monitoring framework to be adopted as an integral part of Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, or at least some groups of indicators, the door is not closed. We definitely will have a process after COP15 for adjustment and updating of those indicators. And as Ezekiel mentioned, that's why there is a suggestion to establish the expert technical group, which actually can help parties and the Secretariat to lead this work in a post-COP15 process. Together, of course, working closely and reporting to SBSTTA for the future iterations of this work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sasha. And can we continue with the questions, please?
Certainly. So I have another question, and it's related, I think, more to sort of a logistical issue and an organization of work issue around SBSTTA. And that question is, how does the chair, noting these various documents that exist, intend to go through the discussion at SBSTTA? So there's lots of documents. There's lots of interconnections, and what is what's the current suggestion on how this issue will be taken up by the subsidiary body? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Of course, it's a complex issue to deal with all the different elements and the requests to SBSTTA to do, and also SBSTTA mean to undertake a scientific and technical review of the goals and targets. And to provide feedback to co-chairs. It will be very important to see, to attend the informal meetings that we're going to have next month, so we can have also a sense of the opinions of the parties and observers on the documents. And also we are discussing at SBSTTA Bureau what can be the best way to hold consultations and the analysis of goals and targets, and also the analysis of headline indicators and the analysis of components and indicators and the complementary ones by groups, since all of them have to make sense when they fit all together. But we're looking the best way to address by parts, by groups, and so the feedback from parties will be very important during informal sessions as well. But then maybe Sasha wants also to add something.
No, not much to add. Again, just bear in mind that official documents, I mean document 3 and addendum 1 are documents really for review by SBSTTA. And then, of course, addendum 2 will provide an important information for SBSTTA to do scientific analysis, while information documents are designed to provide negotiators with additional information informing some of the potential choices when they discuss elements of papers. You also remember, as Ezekiel mentioned, that SBSTTA is not to discuss the language of goals and targets, while SBSTTA is designed to provide advice on scientific aspects of those targets and goals, as well as you can see from monitoring framework in Addendum 1, the components. And okay, of course, the logic of the monitoring framework, the structure of monitoring framework, and send this advice to the open-ended working group. There was also a question, what will happen next? So based on outcomes of SBSTTA, we may produce a new document and updated monitoring framework, and then it will be up to open-ended working group to decide whether open-ended working group decides to have another review of monitoring framework or send it directly to cope with other outcomes of the open-ended working group. Thank you.
Right, and also I remind you to be pending on the publication of Addendum 2 document that will have also part of this analysis of goals and targets to provide us more elements. In a normal meeting of SBSTTA, in a face-to-face one, we were thinking into distributing various contact groups during the different days to accomplish different tasks, to complete analysis by goals, targets, indicators, and so on, headlines, and then to have the pieces together. Of course, it will be a proposal for co-chairs to continue, and also for the conference of the parties. And once the final version of the framework is adopted, then we need to go back in SBSTTA to continue with the development of filling gaps and improving the set of elements for the monitoring. Can we move to next question, please, Secretariat?
Certainly, Chair. So there's a number of questions in the question window relating to the peer review process, and the peer review comments were received, and a number of people are just sort of seeking some clarification on how those peer review comments were taken into account in the preparation of documents. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretariat. As you heard, it was an incredible amount of specific comments, and it was a very huge task for the ones who prepared the document, trying to accommodate the different views on this. Maybe part of this can be also clarified in next presentation. So maybe we can wait a little bit to respond to that. And I don't know if Sasha wants to add something on this one, or we move to next question, keeping in mind that part of this one will be responded hopefully during the next presentation. Sasha?
Yeah, I only can say that we considered all comments, but in the next two presentations, you will get more idea about some criteria and approach, how we were working with the different indicators to make a choice for the current draft. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And can we move to the next question, please?
Sure. So there's a few questions regarding or seeking clarification on the timing of documents, and in particular the addendum that's currently outstanding. So that's the add to document. And the question is essentially, when will these be available? People are noting that documents should be available 6 weeks before the start of the SBSTTA meeting, for example. So perhaps either Chair or Sasha, you'd like to speak to that point. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. Most documents for SBSTTA are already published, still pending Addendum 2, and I think one informative one, and another one on a different topic not related with the monitoring framework. Well, in principle, the rule of 6 weeks in advance is for any official formal meeting. So still time for the formal session in SBSTTA. What we're going to have next month will be an informal session, but I know Secretariat is doing its best to have documents ready. I've been bugging them every time I can. I understand the limitations, but I hope, well, addendum 2 will be soon published. Is that right, Sasha? Yeah, he's nodding.
I just can confirm what you, Chair, said.
Okay, next question, please.
Yes, so there's a question related to the relationship between the work of SBSTA and SBI. So as was mentioned, SBI will address issues that are related to the enhanced approach to reporting, including issues related to synergies with other MEAs. So in relation to that, how or what is the relationship between SBSTA and SBI in this regard? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Well, as you know, the mandate we receive is more focused on the monitoring framework and the scientific elements, and SBI is more on implementation, since mainstreaming, resource mobilization, reporting, in connections also with protocols. That's also a very huge task. So that's why it's so important that the third meeting of the working group have adequate feedback from both bodies to put all pieces together, and then to allow parties with more elements to continue with the definitions of goals and targets and the whole set. I don't know if Secretary wants to add something to this response. I see Sasha's image frozen.
So at SBI, at agenda item 9, so that's already included because it's already referring to monitoring framework. But I like to invite Gillian to provide a few comments, as she is a kind of a liaison between those two processes. Gillian.
Thank you. From the Secretariat side, we have worked hard to make sure that the documentation on both sides are aligned. And so if you are looking at the enhanced review mechanism documents that are under SBI, there is a lot of cross-referencing to the monitoring framework, as the monitoring framework would be a part of how global review is done and how national reporting and assessment is done. And so there are these cross-references. I think that that covers the documentation side. However, if it's more on the process side, I do believe we'll go back to the co-chairs. And I would like to mention, I think Ezequiel, you were in the session probably on Thursday of last week, which was the SBI session on agenda item 9, the webinar on agenda item 9, I mean. And this question was asked there too. So I think that, there is recognition that this alignment needs to happen.
Thank you very much, Gillian. Next question, please, Kieran.
Certainly. So it's a question, I think, again, for clarification, and I think it's you've already touched on it to a certain extent. So the question is so is it correct that the monitoring framework and indicators, but also the proposed updated goals and targets, will be discussed at SBSTA 24? So I guess the question is actually, to what extent will SBSTA be looking at the goals and targets of the framework? Thank you.
Yes, the analysis from SBSTA for goals and targets will be more technical and scientific review. And please be aware of addendum 2 when it's released, to provide elements for this discussion, not for negotiation, just a review. Anything else, Kieran?
So there's an additional question relating to components of the monitoring framework, but with your indulgence, Chair, I would suggest that we perhaps take that question after we've had the presentation on the monitoring framework. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. If there are no more questions on this matter, I think we can move forward with the second presentation. So I'll give the floor to Gillian to continue with our program. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you. I hope that you can see my screen. Obviously, interrupt me if you cannot. So I'm going to give a more detailed presentation on the monitoring framework as it's presented in it is mentioned, of course, in the Chapeau document that Sasha discussed, but it's mostly captured in the Add 1 document. That is where the technical details related to the monitoring framework occur, and so this is where I'm going to really focus in. Before I start, I want to mention I'm not going to go into detail on every indicator that's in the monitoring framework or delve into that level of technical detail. Obviously, there's not time in this session, and so this will mostly be presenting the criteria that was used and the approach in developing the monitoring framework and to describe what the monitoring framework represents. So before getting into the document itself, Sasha mentioned the peer review, and I'd like to come back to that really quick to try to summarize some of the comments. As was mentioned, there were a lot of comments, and all of these comments were tracked. What we tried to do was we tried to gauge some of the general reflections that came out of the peer review. A number of the comments were more general and related to sort of what the next version of the monitoring framework should look like. At the same time, there were a number of specific suggestions related to indicators, indicator wording. There were suggestions related to even target and goal wording, which of course we were not able to consider since that was outside of the scope of the peer review. And there was a lot, in most cases, indicators were suggested for addition and not for removal. Additionally, there were a number of comments that were, different parties had different views. And so in terms of taking the comments into account, it was quite challenging because there was a judgment call that had to happen, especially in cases where different parties were suggesting different wording and different stakeholders were suggesting different things. And so there was an effort by the Secretariat in collaboration with WCMC and working also to ask questions to BIP partners. We attempted to make sure that there was a process that helped us to move forward and identify the monitoring framework that's in the document that you see. In terms of the general feedback from the peer review, there was a lot of comments related to simplification and reducing the duplication in the document that went for peer review. Indicators appeared many places to try to capture the fact that there is a cross-cutting nature of a lot of issues. However, most of the comments were that this needed to be simplified, easier to visualize, and that there needed to be a logical framework element of the indicators and criteria for this framework. And so biological framework, what this means is, some sort of delineation between outcome and output level indicators and how these work in the context of the goals and the targets. There were a lot of comments related to engaging national statistical systems in monitoring, as Sasha also mentioned, and there was comments related to just broadly ensuring national level engagement, and that not only the Ministry of Environment or the national statistical offices, but that many stakeholders were involved at the national level in compiling and pulling information together that could be used for monitoring. Obviously you may have data contained by the ministry responsible for oceans or different ministries that would need to be pulled together for this. And then there was a general consensus. I'm going to use the word consensus, which may not be exactly true, but there was based on the bulk of general comments, there were indications that the idea of headline indicators would be supported. And this would be a small number or smaller number of indicators, which would be useful for assessing both national and global level progress. And so this is sort of the overall comments from the peer review or our interpretation of them. So in terms of implementing this logical framework that I just referenced, in the current version of the document, there's a delineation between the goal level indicators, the state level indicators, and the targets, which represent action indicators. So, for example, the goal indicators would include ecosystem extent or gross ecosystem product. So this is really the state of biodiversity and its interactions with people. And the action indicators would be actions that either governments or people take. So this would be pollution-related indicators, consumption indicators, protected areas, which of course is a policy indicator. So this delineation, we have attempted to maintain this in the monitoring framework that's presented in Add 1. Additionally, there were a lot of comments, and also this is something that comes up in the assessment from WCMC related to balancing aspiration and feasibility. And what I mean by this is that in general, there's a preference to use existing indicators, and this is how the indicators were chosen. If there is an existing indicator available that captures the scope of what is needing to be measured, then this is of course chosen. However, this is not at the expense of measuring what is important. And so if an indicator, if there is an aspect of a goal or a target or a whole goal or target that does not have an indicator available that's suitable for use, then there is a suggestion that something could be developed, particularly if there's already efforts underway to develop such an indicator. If there was no proposal for an indicator and no ideas on how an indicator could be developed, then these gaps still exist. Sorry. And so there are still some gaps in terms of what we would want to measure. Some of this will be captured later, but this is the overall attempt that was made here. And then in terms of the preference for existing methodologies, which have been agreed by an intergovernmental body, this again was in order to ensure that these indicators are nationally relevant and also that there is a way that they will be feasible to measure in the future. In terms of trying to select indicators on this basis, we looked for alignment with the framework for the development of statistics and the system of environmental economic accounting of the UN Statistical Commission. The UN Statistical Commission is the intergovernmental body that covers statistics and has representation from 193 member states. And thus, if the indicators are in these statistical frameworks, this represents that there is already buy-in at the 5 member states. So the monitoring framework then includes 3 different groups of indicators. It includes headline indicators. The headline indicators aim to be a minimum set of high-level indicators which capture the overall scope of the goals and targets. So for each goal or target, there was a minimum set of, a very small number of indicators chosen to try to represent that goal or target. The component indicators are similar, where you have the component indicators aligned with the components that are presented in the paper in order to try to capture each aspect of a goal or a target. And for both the headline indicators and the component indicators, there's this focus on making sure that these indicators can be used to track both national and global progress so that they're relevant at both levels. Then there's a third group of indicators, that the complementary indicators that are useful for thematic or more in-depth analysis. They may not have complete relevance for all countries. They may be more relevant for global analytical products. They're still definitely relevant for analysis, but they are a little bit either less aligned with the goals or the targets as they are elaborated currently, or as I said, that they may be relevant at different levels and not relevant at both the national and global level. So in terms of these criteria, just to recap, the main indicators in terms of the headline and the component indicators is mostly in terms of the broadness of the scope of those indicators. And so the headline indicators try to capture the overall scope of a goal or a target, whereas the component indicators try to capture the scope of a component of a goal or a component of a target. And the complementary indicators provide even more information. So just an example, I think I'll just go through real quick. In target 2, if you look at the headline indicator, it relates to overall total protected area coverage. But then the component indicator splits it down for marine, terrestrial, freshwater, and mountain ecosystems. And so, you know, this 30 by 30, maybe you're looking across all ecosystems, but then at the component level, you do want to look at the marine ecosystems, the terrestrial ecosystems, the mountain ecosystems. And then a complementary indicator on that same target would be the status of key biodiversity areas. There's less data on this, and key biodiversity areas are maybe less relevant for some countries, particularly for the marine protected areas. However, this is something that still definitely would provide additional information for that target. Another example is the pollution indicators. There was no one index, and so this has been attempted to align with the SDG process so that the indicators in Target 6 are very closely aligned with the SDGs and also with the discussions that is going on under the chemicals cluster. Again, back to discussing the headline indicators. I think this was mentioned also. These are being proposed for use in national reports, in all national reports, so that the headline indicators would really be a core part of the national reports. This does not mean that parties could not choose to use additional indicators, could not use the complementary or the component indicators in the national reports, but that at a minimum, all parties would include all of the headline indicators in the national reports. And by reporting or by including these in the national report, there would be 3 options. So either a party could use an existing global data set, which has been disaggregated to the national level, or replace that data set with nationally compiled data, or if they are not comfortable with the globally available data set, but they do not have an additional data set, then they could say no data, so that, you know, they have captured at least their views. And a subset of the headline indicators would then be selected for national or global communication products as needed. And so countries could decide which indicators are most important for them in terms of the media and in terms of communicating, and ideally select from those headline indicators. An example, of course, would be the 30 by 30, so the protected areas indicators. Just to elaborate or go into what I mean by this national reporting example, this is actually from the 6th National Report of South Africa, where they did something very similar to what's being suggested in this paper. They included the global IUCN Red List Index for South Africa. They also included a national Red List Index for South Africa. And so in this situation, South Africa obviously does have a national red list. And so this is something that they could choose to use in their report. The indicator criteria that were used to develop the framework, this is how the indicators were chosen at these different levels. As was mentioned, the first criteria was really relevance for the goal or the target, with the aim to reduce duplication. And then additional criteria related to the data is currently available with available data or could be available soon. And so I was mentioning before that if it was possible, then the go-to is showing up over the top of my slide. Sorry about that. So in terms of goal C, there's an indicator related to the number of research and development results or publications shared as a result of an ABS agreement. This aligns with the goal C aspect related to non-monetary benefits of ABS. However, obviously, R&D results and publications do not cover the full scope of non-monetary benefits. However, there was no suggestion of an alternative indicator, and benefits of ABS are very difficult to measure, and so this is why an indicator that doesn't cover the entire scope of the goal is suggested as a headline indicator. It really is something that could be developed over time. However, this is the best indicator that existed that was proposed at the current time. On the other hand, for target 18, there is an indicator related to official development assistance, public expenditure, and private expenditure on conservation and biodiversity. And although private expenditure is not something that is measured by most countries, and public expenditure is only being measured by some, there is work underway to develop methodology, and more countries are doing it. And so it's included in the proposal, even though right now ODA is the only aspect of the indicator where there's really strong data. So it's kind of a mixed approach in the framework. Other criteria include that an indicator has been or is likely to be agreed through a scientific or an intergovernmental process. As was mentioned, the UN Statistical Commission is one intergovernmental process that we looked at. For example, in Goal B, the gross ecosystem product, this is an indicator that's being developed under the UN System of Environmental Economic Accounts, which is through the UN Statistical Commission. And so this was considered as a strong proposal. The percentage of land covered by land scale land use plans for terrestrial, freshwater, and marine ecosystems. This is in the SDGs. It's in different SDGs, but we could combine it. And another example would be in Goal 1, the proportion of populations maintained within species. This is an indicator that is being developed by the GeoBond, and they have a full proposal that's been fleshed out on how this will be measured. And so there are systems behind these which fed into including them in the selection criteria. I mentioned this at the beginning, but additionally, there was a criteria related to ensuring that all the indicators at the headline and the component level are both nationally and globally relevant, with the ability to aggregate up to the global level and down to the national level without creating bias. And so in this case, because the indicators are being proposed for use in the national reports, they're being proposed for use in national planning processes, there is a real need to ensure that these indicators have national relevance. Additionally, the indicators are being proposed for use in the global assessment process and in the gap report that's discussed in the SBI documents. And so there's a need to ensure that the indicators can function at both levels. And so this is why the indicators that were selected at the headline and component level are relevant at both levels and not only at one or the other. And an example here would be the Red List Index. There's a global database. There's also national databases and national methodologies, which was highlighted already earlier. Additionally, instead of just using simple number of countries which have legislative, administrative, or policy frameworks, the framework proposes to use the extent to which legislative, administrative, or policy frameworks are effective. And the reason for this is because these number of indicators, which is something that's used in the SDGs, are not really effective at the national level for informing policy. And so then the extent would be based on a subjective assessment, which we're hoping to develop. So as was mentioned, there was preference given to data availability, but not only to data availability, there was also a preference for an existing global program or entity that is working on the indicator, which would also be in a position to provide capacity building activities. In order to roll these indicators out and have uptake at the national level, there will be a need for capacity building, particularly to ensure that there is the option to use these in the national reports. And in the same vein, the indicators that are already being used by national governments were given preference due to the fact that then there's an opportunity for experience sharing, and there is proof that these indicators can and do work at the national level. And this also then facilitates the opportunity to work with the UN Statistical Commission and the statistical community to ensure that these indicators are not only used in this process, but across different processes. And indicators where subnational or geospatial disaggregation is possible, we're also given preference at the headline and component level. I think that this is particularly important in terms of subnational level analysis, and this came up in a number of questions from the morning session related to different groups that might be interested in using the monitoring framework, whether it's indigenous populations and local communities or subnational government. If geospatial disaggregation is available, then you can look within ecosystems, you can look within districts, you can look across borders and do analysis from many, many different angles, in addition, of course, to being able to do national level analysis. So before I conclude, I just wanted to walk through what the indicator looks like in the document. This is a snip, I just took a snip out of the document to show you what it looks like in Add 1 in case you haven't opened the document yet. And so on the far left, we have the goals, and then next to the goals are the headline indicators, where the headline indicators aim to align with the goal. Then the components of the goal are represented, and then the component indicators aim to represent with the component of the goal. And so the indicator, the goal here related to area and connectivity, the headline indicator is the extent of natural ecosystems, so covering the entire area aspect of the goal. And then the component is also the extent of natural ecosystems, but it's broken down by terrestrial, freshwater, and marine. And so the component indicator would be broken down by terrestrial, freshwater, and marine. Additionally, we've actually specified that it would be broken down by forests, savannas, grasslands, wetlands, mangroves, etc. And then the complementary indicators, as you can see, provide much more information that could be used to assess the goal. So before I conclude, I want to come back to the idea of the expert group that was mentioned earlier in the session. There is still work to do on this indicator framework, or the monitoring framework. As mentioned, there is a need to build capacity. So there's a need for advice on capacity building needs and modality. There are still gaps in the framework where there's a need for gap filling advice in order to fill either temporal or spatial data gaps or data gaps with respect to different components and how big data can be used in this context. And there's a real need to provide technical advice on the implementation of the indicators in the monitoring framework, including making sure that the definitions are available, that there's metadata that describes how indicator methodologies work at the national level. So not only at the global level, but at the national level, and a need for promoting sharing of best practices. And so there is a group that has been described in the main chapeau document in the Annex 2. And so this is being presented as a proposal for SAPs to consider, for them to consider making a proposal to the COP to establish such a group. And this group could also then help to ensure at the very end the alignment between the monitoring framework and the goals and the targets, especially due to the fact that the goals and targets are likely to be only agreed at the COP. I mean, the text of those is likely to be only really worked out around that time. So from my side, that is all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Gillian for very detailed presentation. I hope it helps participants to understand the process and the different challenges to compile the information, to think about how best to propose indicators at the various levels, headlines or by component or complementary, and how to measure if we're going to the right direction, not to lose the focus of the key point of these elements. Is not an easy task, and the various considerations to to move forward. Before we come to questions, let's now move to the last presentation of our session. I would like to give the floor to UNEP WCMC for the overview of information document 16 with lots of valuable information indicators. So I give the floor to Catherine Despot-Belmont to provide us an overview on this information document. Catherine, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ezekiel. I'll try to be quick so we have enough time to for questions. As Julia noted, it's hard to provide detail of the information of each indicator that was included on the document. The information document is now available on the SBSTA page. So I'm just going to discuss the methodology that UNEP WCMC used to assess the availability and suitability of indicators that could be used to monitor progress towards the different draft targets and goals. You know the context of the peer review. UNEP WCMC prepared a first draft of the information document, which was made available in the peer review process. And after the peer review, we collected all suggestions from observers and parties and included that information on the updated version of the information document, which is available now. The purpose of our work and the information document was to identify available indicators, because that was the call that was made as a recommendation from SBSTA 23, identifying a range of relevant existing indicators, and that was the work that we did. And we spent months collecting the information. As we know, there was a huge amount of input from observers and non-party and parties. So just on indicators, we collated over 5,000 comments. So in order to organize the information of suggestions that were made for indicators, we organized information following 4 categories. The first one was gap filling indicators. We wanted to identify those indicators that seem to have potential to fill in indicator gaps in the draft monitoring framework, which was made available for peer review in May, and also on our own information document. New indicators, these were suggestions of indicators that were not included in the draft monitoring framework or the draft version of our information document. There were some suggestions for modified data on specific indicators that were made available on the draft monitoring framework and the information document. And there were also some suggestions to delete indicators. So we recorded all of that information based on those categories. And then we followed 2 steps. The first step was to identify indicators that are available, that exist now. And the second one, sorry, I missed my screen. And the second one was to assess the suitability. So the first step was developing a methodology to help us to identify available indicators. And the next step was to assess the suitability of those indicators that we identified as available. So first of all, on the first step, we transfer all of the comments from peer review. We standardize the information. The team developed a decision tree, which is available. The decision tree is available on Annex 4 of the information document. And then all of those indicators that were identified as available, meaning that there was an institution in charge of developing the indicator. We could verify that there was data available, the frequency of update, the level of disaggregation or aggregation of the different indicators, and a number of a reduced number of available indicators were sent to be assessed for suitability. I think we had 399 indicators that were confirmed as available, and they were promising candidates. And the second step was to assess the suitability of the indicators. We wanted to have some robust methodology to help us make that decision. So we used published methodology that was previously used for the midterm review on progress towards the Aichi targets. This methodology was also used on other global indicator assessments in 2015 and 2016. So we chose that methodology to assess the suitability of all indicators that were identified. And the methodology focuses on 3 scoring criteria. The first criteria is related to alignment. So how well does that indicator aligns to the text of, in our case, the specific monitoring elements for targets and goals. Then the second criteria is related to temporal relevance and data points. And the third one is on spatial coverage, how many continents and countries does the indicator includes. So these were the thresholds used for scoring the indicator. An indicator could achieve a maximum of 9 points. So indicators were score, if they score highly, they achieve 3 points, medium 2 points, and low 1 point. The thresholds and the scoring criteria was based on the published methodology from Titensor and colleagues in 2014. So in terms of alignment and scoring for alignment, Titensor and colleagues noted that there's a level of subjectivity for scoring indicators for alignment. So in order to address this issue, UNEP WCNC identified people with specific expertise in the different areas from goals and targets, and they provided separate scores and provided a justification for the score provided, as well as the data and links to the data that they used to make that assessment. And then all alignment scores were reviewed by UNEP WCNC's chief scientist, and in the final score also provided justification for that. Then in terms of scoring for temporal relevance, as you can see on the screen, it is very clear what for each indicator what would receive a high score if they had more than 5 data points. If they had less than 5 data points, they would receive a medium, and if they had less than 2 data points, they would score low. Same with spatial coverage. Indicators that cover 5 continents or more, and they at least have data for 20 countries, they were scored highly, and then less than that would be medium or low. Additionally, the assessment team included an extra category, which was unknown, and this was only for indicators that we couldn't validate the number of data points or the spatial coverage, meaning that the data wasn't publicly available online. Some other important considerations about the assessment and the methodology used is that, again, we only assess indicators that are available now. Through the peer review comment, there were many aspirational indicators, so it would be ideal to have them, but we couldn't verify that they exist. But there are also many promising indicators that are currently being developed, but they couldn't be assessed. However, if these indicators become available before the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework is agreed, then we can run the analysis again and include those indicators as when they become available. The methodology used help us to identify indicators that address indicator gaps, but it also helped us to identify what are the remaining gaps and where further work for producing indicators should be targeted at. So there were different comments from observers, from parties of indicators, for example, of let's say the red list index, that it was suggested for a goal or a target or specific components of different goals and targets. So we assessed all suggestions, and depending on the alignment, some indicators score really highly for specific target components or goals, and for a different target that the same indicator would have been proposed is scored medium. So on the final output, we provide all high scoring and medium scoring indicators. The list of indicators and our findings are available on 3 different annexes in the information document. The first one has a mapping of the draft monitoring framework that was made available for peer review in May, and all of those indicators that achieve high scores or medium scores. And we also organized this information. In total, there were 155 indicators that achieved the highest and medium scores. And we organized that information on alphabetical order and mapped to the specific goals and targets that they relate to. And finally, we provided another annex trying to show how the different available indicators that we've identified map with the proposed headline indicators. And that's it from me. I think we're ready for questions, Ezekiel.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, both Catherine and Gillian, for both presentations. Let's move now to questions. Thank you very much for all the work of WCMC. It's an amazing amount of work to put all this together, and with this information document to complement the elements we have in addendum 1 and addendum 2. I hope it can facilitate the full understanding of this complexity. Can we go then to questions from Secretariat, please? Kieran, can you help us?
Yes, certainly. So at the outset, I'll just note, somebody asked if we would be making presentations available that have been shown here during the webinar. So I'll just note that we will make them available after the session, along with the recording from the session. So given that, so there's a question tying in the issues that were discussed last week in the webinars on SBI and today. So the question is, sorry, I'm just, I've lost my question. 1 second. So in the webinar last week and in the documentations that have been, the documentation that's been prepared for the agenda item on the proposed approach for reviewing implementation, there's a proposal that countries would set national commitments. And then the question is, would that same sort of issue apply to the headline indicator? So would countries also, I guess, be required to use headline indicators, and what's the relationship between the headline indicators and these commitments? Thank you.
Gillian, would you like to respond to that one, I guess?
Yes, thank you. So as is described in the SBI 3/11 document, the national commitments would be due, the initial national commitments would be due 1 year after the COP. And these would represent really a political commitment of where a party would like to be by the end of the period. At the current time, it is not proposed that these indicators would then be used in the formulation of the commitments or in the determination of political commitments. They would come up in the reporting, though, in the national reports when the countries are asked to reflect on the commitments. It would be nice if parties were able to use the indicators in the commitments. However, I think that based on the timing, it's slightly ambitious. And additionally, I believe that the idea behind the commitments is to make them as simple as possible to really sort of leverage the ambition that comes out of the COP. And I think that that might be distilled if the indicators were a large part of that. So this is why that is not included in the proposal for the commitments. Thank you.
I hope it clarifies this. One thing is a political commitment and the way to measure how it's moving, and another is the global agreement on the headline indicators to be included in national reports for the future. Next question, please, Kieran.
Certainly. So there's actually a few questions that are directed to you, Chair. Basically, they're noting that SBSTTA has a lot on its agenda, in particular with regards to this issue. And given those time constraints, what's your approach or your vision for how time would be allocated to this issue during the SBSTTA discussions? Thank you.
Well, please be sure that we will try our best to use the time at SBSTTA during the formal meetings, either by contact groups. So it depends on the nature of the meeting at the end of the day. It will be face-to-face or hybrid to best accommodate the time to cover as much as possible all the different duties we will charge. So during the informal session will be very useful to know the views of parties, to see how comments can guide us, and of course this will continue in consultations with my colleagues in the SBSTTA Bureau to accommodate the best packages on the time to fill as much as possible, to address the main points and elements, to agree as much as possible as we can. Of course, we understand this will be a partial effort once we have the complete framework adopted by COP, and then to reconvene and continue improving the system. The next question, please.
Certainly. So there's a question on the relationship between the documentation that WCMC prepared. So this is the information document and the official pre-session documents. So the question is, so what's the relationship between these documents? So how do they complement one another? And are there any similarities or differences between the two documents that should be noted? Thank you.
Maybe WCMC would like to respond, but in principle, for example, addendum 1 is a pre-session document, it's an official one. We'll work on that, and then the information document is additional information to support the understanding and the sources of information, but I will allow the authors to complement what I'm saying. So Catherine, maybe?
Yeah, so the purpose of the information document, and as I explained already, came from the recommendation from SBSTTA 23. Our task was to prepare an information document with existing available indicators. And additionally, to provide something useful to aid discussions, we just wanted to make sure that the indicators are suitable for the draft components of targets and goals, and that's why we implemented published scientific methodology to do that. So in the document, we mapped the results of analysis, the indicators that are available now, and they are suitable for specific components. But also we provided information that is useful to support the discussions, which is related to the criteria and headline indicators, which is if the indicators can be disaggregated at the national level, or if they are aggregated from national data to form a global indicator. And as well as information about if the indicator is being used under other conventions or processes, because this will help to enhance synergies with other conventions and processes, and also reduce the reporting burden on parties. So that's the criteria that we followed. We work closely with the Secretariat. Over to Gina.
Yeah, so I think the main difference between the two documents, as Catherine said, is that, you know, we mentioned different criteria for choosing indicators to be a headline indicator or component indicator. What WCMC did was they looked at each indicator and they saw which criteria it met. So they didn't determine the criteria that were going to be used for the headline indicators. They had a set of a number of issues which align, you know, data availability or the availability at different spatial scales. And so they went and assessed each indicator. And then, as Catherine said, you know, it was really a team effort. Then what we did at the SCBD side was to say, okay, based on the information that is coming out of this analysis, which indicators meet the criteria that has been set out? And so my view is, for those of you who are trying to analyze the documents, if you want to understand more details about the indicator, which would give you a picture of perhaps why that indicator is being used or not used, then the IMF document is going to have that much more detail, whereas in the addendum, that analysis has already we've already attempted to do that analysis, and so the indicators are already presented in a format in that addendum, as opposed to going through the entire analysis in that document. Thank you.
Thank you. Also, I think it's worth to repeat the nature of documents is different. A pre-session document and the addendums are official for negotiations, while information documents are useful reference that we may take into account, but not to negotiate anything. But the full analysis and set of sources is there. In the case you need to consult it, but negotiations will be based on document 3 and the addendums, in particular addendum 1, which is proposing the 3 levels of indicators for headlines, for components, and complementary ones. I hope that clarifies the question. Can we move to the next one, Kieran?
Yes, so there's another question, and it's perhaps a question for you, Chair, or for Sasha, and it's on what's the relationship or what's the role envisaged for the components of the goals and targets which currently appear in the monitoring framework, and will these be included in any sort of decision or recommendation from either, I suppose, SBSTTA or the call? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe Sasha would like to respond.
At this stage, as you know, that it was included into official documents for SBSTTA. That's of course for SBSTTA to make a decision whether components are staying. That's also actually mean, of course, in relation to the monitoring framework, whether this group of indicators may stay as well. So, but we expect that components of goals and targets will stay, and they will be integral part of the monitoring framework, as they basically explaining more in details the meaning of each goal and target, and also provide this additional opportunity for review, reporting, and again, the better understanding what is behind goals and targets. So we expect it to stay and be again the part of the monitoring framework as they are suggested today. But at the end, as you know, that's up to parties how they like to design their monitoring framework, and whether it will stay after the third meeting of the open-ended working group, but also, of course, whether COP will make a decision, that's up to parties to decide. But the expectation is that they will be an integral part of the monitoring framework. Thank you.
Thank you, Sasha. And I'd like to very briefly share my experience with, as I see the evolution since we adopt Aichi targets in Nagoya. I remember when we were drafting some of the goals and targets, and those targets are very complex. For example, if you say pollution, are you doing something in pollution? Yes or no? But it's different if you talk about pollution of air or soil or water or sea. And it was very nice to see in GBO5 when we saw the assessment of the 20 targets that were divided by components. So it makes sense to subdivide complex targets into meaningful pieces. That's why, at least that's my point of view, that we see in Annex 1 that there are suggestions of components and indicators associated to those components to see altogether if it's explaining or measuring exactly what we want to measure, to understand and to see if the target is being addressed properly, the target or the goal. That's why there is a merit to include components, and it will be part of SBSTA to agree on those components for targets as a second level of indicators after headline ones, and then the complementary ones could be very, very specific, easy in some cases, but at the end of the day, we need to be sure to not to lose the focus of goals and targets when we are proposing this monitoring framework. I hope the explanation helps on my personal interpretation. Can we go to next one, please, Kieran?
Yes, Chair. So there's, I think, one last question, and it's I believe, a question for clarification, and is that, so the question is, are all the headline indicators numeric? So I guess, do all the headline indicators have a quantitative value associated with them? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't know if our colleagues can help us on this. I mean, of course, we prefer to have any numerical, but sometimes it's quite difficult, and then we need to move from quantitative to qualitative ones, and there are many methodologies to do this, but I allow the expert to enlighten us.
So at the headline and the component, at the headline and the component level, all of the indicators are quantitative time series type indicators. As was mentioned, the use of these would be to track progress over time at both the national and global level. And so then in order to track progress over the time and aggregate up and down between national and global level, it's really important to have quantitative indicators. Thanks.
Nice. Anybody else? Okay. Well, it's a challenge. I hope we can reach to quantitative ones and without going to interpretation to develop class or something else to understand how we approach it. But this is highly related to the combination of goals and targets that parties will agree at the end of the day. I'm sorry to say that, but in Rome, I was trying to make some intervention, say, are we sure what parties want to have included in the framework, and does it make sense? Do you have a clue how are we going to measure this? There are many ideas around that are important to see how are we trying to update for next framework, biodiversity framework in general, and what we want to achieve, and how are we going to measure. There are some issues that are very complex to understand, as we saw in previous presentation on ABS, for example, or on Cartagena protocol. I mean, some cases is a number, some cases is how are we approaching, are we covering? And that's a challenge to see when it's quantitative or qualitative. But let's go one by one during the sessions. I hope we can agree at least the set of headline indicators that will be in the scenario be part of national reports, and then we can move down to components and additionals, because this is also part of the questions in how can we approach in SBSTA analysis, and the whole analysis, the technical analysis of goals and targets, have to provide feedback to coaches. It's a lot of work. I hope we can go right and clear on the different segments during our deliberations in SBSTA. At least that's my hope. Kieran, you said that was the last question, or?
That's correct. There's no more questions, Chair.
Is there one or no more?
No, sorry, there's no more questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't know if my colleagues would like to add any comments before closing, since we're reaching to the end of our session.
I'm sorry, Chair. I'm just another question just sort of slipped in. So with your indulgence, I'll ask it if that's all right.
Please go ahead.
So it's a question to you, in fact, and it's a question about, perhaps you can clarify: is the monitoring framework the only issue that's going to be considered under this item?
Yes, yes. Agenda item 3 is about to the monitoring framework. Of course, we will have an analysis of goals and targets from the technical point of view with non-negotiations, and then to see the monitoring framework on the different levels. Yes, of course, SBSTTA later we're going to see on Thursday. We're going to be dealing with other agenda items, but the key topic, as you can see in document 3, is the monitoring framework, which includes a recommendation from SBSTTA and to the COP, and also the headline indicator set, and also terms of reference for the expert group, and including both addendums to and the information documents. This is how agenda item 3 is composed, also with some reference to GBO5 that we already did in the past. Maybe Sasha want to add something?
No, not much. Just to reiterate what you said, that of course we have also document number 2, which is on GBO, and there are some pretty straightforward recommendations. And definitely don't forget that the main, in a way, formal outcome of SBSTTA recommendations. So, and recommendations are included into document 3. So those recommendations need to be negotiated and agreed. So it's not just addendum 1 to be negotiated. And of course, don't forget the component in addendum 2, which is not for negotiation as such, but again, SBSTTA is supposed to provide some ideas on components and scientific rigors of goals and targets as they are proposed. So that's also can be reflected in the outcomes of SBSTTA. But again, the documents, as Chair said several times, that the formal documents, which are 2, 3, and addendum 1, are making the main negotiation part. 2 and 3 in the parts of recommendations, and addendum 1 more or less in its entirety. And then again, to be very much linked to the addendum 2 and informed by different elements of information document 16 and 12. But as I mentioned, also don't forget to use for kind of establishing your position and thinking how you can address one or another issue, other information documents provided by different partners. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Sasha. I hope it clarifies the question, and we'll do our best in organizing our deliberations. If my colleagues don't want to add anything else, and since there are no more questions, it was a good number of questions for feedback. I see David Cooper. Do you want to add something, David?
Just to thank you, SCQ, as well as all of the presenters for this webinar, and to thank everyone for participating. And certainly we look forward to a very lively and useful informal session, and then followed by the formal session of SBSTTA 24 on this very important issue. So thanks to all.
Thank you, David. So dear colleagues, this now brings us to the end of today's webinar. Thank you all for participating today, and I hope that you found the webinar informative and that it will be helpful in your understanding on this agenda item in preparation for SBSTTA 24. If participants wish to follow up on matters related to agenda item 3, the our secretariat is available to answer questions and, if needed, consider additional webinars in the future. I hope that many of you will also participate in webinars next Thursday and Tuesday related to other agenda items of SBSTTA 24. I would also like to thank the Secretariat and WCMC for preparing and organizing this session today, and to our partners in contributing to the process. Again, thank you all for joining us today. This webinar is now concluded. Thank you very much. Good morning and good evening, good night in Mexico time and the Americas. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.